My name is Dana Weller. I was 31 years old and I drove 610 miles to a party that was never a party. My husband called that Friday and said he had something to show me. I brought our 14-month-old daughter and a bag of diapers, and when I pushed open my own front door, every person in his family was already seated in rented folding chairs, and nobody stood up. He set a stapled envelope on the coffee table and told the room our daughter wasn't his. His mother pointed at the door and told me to get out of her son's house. Then the door opened again behind me. I want to tell you the truth before you get your hopes up, because I know what you're waiting for. The person who walked through that door did not come to rescue me, but here's what none of them understood yet. The report on that table was accurate. The lab had done nothing wrong. And in 6 weeks, I was going to explain that difference to 90 people at once. Welcome back to Quiet Reckoning, the channel for the people who didn't fight back in the room because they were already writing down the date on the back of a receipt. If that sounds like you, stay with me through this one. Leave a comment when you're done, and subscribe if you want more of these. I'm a major in the United States Army, 11 years in, commissioned through ROTC on a scholarship because there wasn't a family fund to send me anywhere else. I run logistics, which people hear as spreadsheets, and which is actually the discipline of knowing exactly where every object is, who's holding it, and when it last moved. 2 tour behind me. I brief exhausted rooms before sunrise, and that job teaches you one habit. Say the true sentence first, and put everything else after it. I was stationed at Fort Rucker in Alabama. Our daughter Isla lived there with me in base housing and spent weekdays at the Child Development Center while I worked. My husband, Marcus, stayed in Alder Creek, Ohio, running my grandfather's hardware store, a geographic bachelor setup, the Army calls it, and a good third of the people I served with lived some version of it. He drove down when he could. I flew up on leave. 610 miles sat between our 2 front doors. Hold that number. It matters more than anything else here, and I didn't know that yet. Weller's Feed and Supply sits on Route 9 in Alder Creek, Ohio, opened in the spring of 1968. My grandfather nailed a cast-iron bell above the door the week it opened, and it still hangs there. My grandmother, Ruth Weller, ran the counter alone for nearly 40 years until she was 84. She died in the winter of 2023 at 88, and her will left the building, the 18 acres behind it, and every item of inventory to me. Just me. Somewhere around $580,000, if you're the kind of person who tallies things that way. My husband was exactly that kind of person, and I need to say this honestly, because skipping it would make me a liar. For nearly 2 years, Marcus was the one who unlocked that store at 6 in the morning. He built the online storefront from nothing. He signed the largest feed contract in 3 counties. He took a dying business and made it profitable again, and he was good at it, better by the end than I would have been. And the sign above the door still said Weller. In August of last year, on my attorney's recommendation, I moved the store into a single-member LLC with my name as the only owner, and I left the signed paperwork sitting on our kitchen counter for almost a week. Marcus saw it. He never mentioned it once. I sealed that store shut in August. What I didn't understand yet was that you cannot put a 14-month-old inside a limited liability company. I learned that in February. The text arrived on a Wednesday about 10 days out. "Come home this weekend," he wrote. "I've got something for you. In the military, we have a word for language that sounds sweet and isn't. I didn't use that word at the time because I was 31 and tired and my husband was being warm to me for the first time in months, and I wanted that warmth badly enough that I didn't examine it. I want you to hear that clearly. I wanted it to be true." He asked what time I'd land. I told him around 4. 2 days later he asked again, what time exactly on Saturday, and I read that as excitement. It was a call time. It was staging. I took 10 days of leave starting on a Friday. Isla cried from somewhere around mile 300, straight through the hills where the radio cuts out, and I pulled off at a gas station outside Chillicothe and fed her crackers off the trunk of the car in the cold, and she found that hilarious, the funniest thing that had happened to her in her whole short life. I remember that better than almost anything else from that day. It was the last hour of my old life, and I spent it in a gas station lot with my daughter and a box of crackers, and it was good. I reached Alder Creek a little after 10. 8 cars lined Birch Street, and I remember thinking that was strange and letting the thought go. I walked through my own front door with Isla on my hip, and the living room was full. 28 people. His mother's entire side, cousins I'd only met at our wedding, 2 uncles I could barely place, all seated in metal folding chairs, the kind you borrow from a church basement. No cake anywhere, no streamers, nothing on the counters. Not one object in that house said celebration, and I want you to sit with that, because I didn't, not for another week. You do not borrow 28 chairs for a surprise party. You borrow 28 chairs for a hearing. His mother, Vivian, was perched in the center of the couch with her hands folded in her lap like she was at church. Marcus was standing, and nobody rose when I walked in. That's the part that still sits in my chest. 28 people watched a woman come through the door after a 9-hour drive with a baby on her hip, and not one of them stood up. Marcus pulled a stapled packet out from under a magazine on the coffee table and dropped it, rather than handing it to me so that it made a sound when it landed. He spoke to the room, not to me. "She's not mine," he said. And 28 faces turned toward me at exactly the same moment. Nobody gasped. Nobody looked surprised, because none of them were hearing it for the first time. I was the only person in that living room finding out anything. Vivian raised her arm and pointed at the front door. "Leave right now," she said. And here is what I did, and I've had a great deal of time to think about whether it was the right call. I said nothing at all. I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't ask a single question, because 11 years in uniform had taught me that letting a room watch you bleed is a tactical error. So I stood there holding my daughter in total silence, and I listened to 28 people decide that my silence was an admission of guilt. I could feel it happening in real time, and I could not stop it. Marcus reached down and picked the packet back up off the table, and then the door opened behind me again. The man who walked in was maybe 50, wearing a windbreaker, holding a clipboard. He didn't glance at Vivian. He didn't glance at Marcus. He didn't look at the 28 people sitting in borrowed chairs. I've thought about that since, because it told me he'd stood in a great many living rooms exactly like this one, and he had a rule about it. He looked only at me and said my name as a question. I told him yes, because I'm the sort of person who answers when someone says my name, which is a habit I've had to make peace with. He put the papers in my hand, said quietly that he was sorry, and I believed he meant it. Then he left. A divorce complaint, filed in county court 8 days earlier, and clipped behind it, an emergency custody petition. My husband had filed for divorce more than a week before he swabbed anything. Sit with that. The paternity report wasn't the reason he acted. He didn't discover something and get his heart broken and run to a courthouse. He filed the paperwork first, and then he went and manufactured a prop to justify it. And 28 members of his mother's family sat in rented chairs and watched me get served divorce papers in my own living room. At a gathering, I'd been invited to under false pretenses. You've been waiting for someone to walk through that door and save me. So was I, honestly, for about 4 seconds. Nobody did. That isn't how this story goes. I know precisely how long I stayed in that house, because I checked the dashboard clock twice afterward, the way you do when you no longer trust your own memory. 90 seconds. I walked back out through 28 people without a word, and a woman I'd sat beside at a Thanksgiving 2 years earlier pulled her purse tight against her hip as I passed. I carried Isla to the car, buckled her in, and my hands were completely steady, which frightened me more than anything else that day. 11 years of training, and my body simply ran the checklist, while the rest of me trailed behind it. Then I closed the door and backed out of my own driveway. My daughter had existed inside that house for roughly 4 minutes of her entire life, and she was already an exhibit. That story ended in 90 seconds and never restarted because I never carried her back through that door again. Not for her belongings, not for a holiday, not once. I drove 19 miles to a motel off Route 35 and got a room with 2 beds, laid her down in one, and sat on the edge of the other with the bathroom light on so I could read. People always ask me the same question first, so let me answer it up front. I did everything correctly. Everything. I'm not being defensive, I'm laying out the facts because the facts are the entire reason this ends the way it does. My grandfather's store had gone into a single-member LLC the previo. Us August, with me as the sole owner, on the advice of an attorney I paid out of pocket. The inheritance sat in a separate account under my name only, and across 3 years I never once mixed a single dollar of it with anything marital. Never a car payment, never a vacation. I kept every receipt in a folder because I am the kind of person who keeps receipts in a folder. My separate property was locked, and I knew it. And here's the thing, so did he. He'd seen that LLC paperwork sitting on the kitchen counter in August, and he understood within about 10 seconds that the store would never, under any circumstance, belong to him. So he stopped trying for the store. That's the entire mechanism behind everything that followed. I had armored the one asset I could legally armor, and he simply walked around it and put his hand on the one thing that cannot be filed away in a cabinet. You cannot put a 14-month-old into an LLC. There's no form for that. I sat on the edge of a motel bed at 2 in the morning with a court summons in my lap and my daughter breathing 4 feet away, and that sentence kept looping. It's still looping now. I read the custody petition 3 times that night. The argument was clean, and I say that as a professional evaluating an opposing brief, not as a compliment. It wasn't hysterical. It didn't call me names. It said the mother is largely absent, subject to sudden deployment, living 610 miles from the child's extended family, her presence intermittent at best. Then, in the alternative, and this is where it turned surgical, the child is not a product of the marriage. Attached, a sworn statement from Otto Vance, who has worked the register at my grandfather's store since 1998, who taught me to cut a key when I was 10. One line. Over the past 2 years, I have personally seen Major Weller in this store on 9 occasions. I pulled up my phone and went back through 18 months of leave dates, flight records, and drive logs, fully expecting to catch him in a lie. He hadn't lied. It was 9 days. Otto Vance had put his hand on something and sworn to it, and every word was true, and that truth is exactly what made it the most dangerous document in the stack. You can cross-examine a lie. You cannot cross-examine a true sentence. You can only stand beside it and hope someone asks a second question. Sometime around 4 in the morning, I forced myself to do the hardest thing in this account, sit there and look at everything from where Marcus stood. 2 years. Call it 700 mornings, unlocking a door in the dark, starting a pot of coffee older than either of us. He knew every farmer within 30 miles, knew which ones were behind on payment, and carried them anyway, quietly, the way my grandmother used to. I hadn't taught him that. He looked at a business that was fading and he rescued it, not because he loved me, but because he loved the work. And his name appeared on none of it, not the deed, not the sign, not one page. He'd seen that LLC paperwork in August and understood the thing he'd rebuilt with his hands could never belong to him, and he'd sat on that for 6 months in silence. I understood him completely, and I want that on the record, because it would be easier for me if I didn't. He wasn't wrong about the store. He simply decided he was willing to put my 14-month-old on a coffee table in front of 28 relatives to get it back. That's a separate conversation, and it doesn't have a second side. Alder Creek has under 2,000 residents, and I'd been away for 11 years, and I discovered that week that neither fact protected me at all. 4 days after the ambush, I walked into the pharmacy for diapers, and 2 people I'd known since kindergarten found sudden interest in a shelf rather than look at me. A woman I'd shared a desk with in 4th grade turned her cart around at the end of an aisle, not quite fast enough for me to miss it. We both knew Vivian had been busy, church, the salon, the diner where half the town eats. I have to give my mother-in-law her due because she's sharper than people gave her credit for. She never once said the word cheated. She said there was a test, that's all. Then she let 2,000 people build the rest of the story themselves. That's the whole craft of it. You don't hand a town a finished story, you hand them the first sentence and let them write the ending. By the close of that week, I understood the verdict had already landed. Nobody in Alder Creek ever said the word to my face. They simply stopped saying my name. I want to give you one piece of advice right here, because it's the entire reason I'm still upright. If anyone ever hands you a document meant to end your life, read the last page first. All of it, including the small print nobody bothers with, because that's where they're legally required to hide the truth. If that's useful, subscribe, because I'll keep telling these exactly as I happened. Carla Reyes practices family law out of a converted storefront in the county seat, $280 an hour, and she took a $4,000 retainer off my card before reading a single page, which I respected. She read the petition in 5 minutes, then gave me 3 facts, no comfort attached, and I wrote them on the back of a motel receipt. First, custody jurisdiction generally follows wherever the child has lived the previous 6 months, and Isla had lived at Fort Rucker her whole life. Ohio might not even have standing. Second, the Service Members Civil Relief Act lets me request an automatic 90-day stay if military duty interferes with my ability to participate. Third, my family care plan, 20 regulation-mandated pages laying out exactly who has my daughter, when, and under what circumstances, signed the previous October. I sat in that office understanding, with total clarity, that I was already winning, and it wasn't close. I felt worse walking out than walking in, and I couldn't have told you why yet. Carla took her glasses off. "Major," she said, "you're going to win this in June. I need you to understand that winning isn't the same thing as this being over." Early one morning in March, before Marcus arrived, I drove to the store. I have a key, I own the building, and for a stretch there I'd forgotten that. I didn't go inside. I walked around to the alley where my grandmother had put 2 recycling bins in 2005, bins that hadn't moved since because nothing in that building moves unless somebody dies. I went through them in the cold. Flattened feed cartons, a pizza box, junk mail addressed to a woman 3 years gone. And near the bottom, folded but not torn, a white prepaid mailer from a home DNA testing company. Kit gone, return label peeled off. On the lid, a printed, barcoded kit number. He'd thrown it out at work, not at home, where his mother might have found it and believed him anyway. Which meant somewhere in the part of him still functioning, my husband knew this was garbage that needed to vanish somewhere untraceable. I'm a logistics officer, my whole career is one skill, knowing where a thing was, who had it, and when it moved. I stood behind my grandmother's store at 6 in the morning holding a barcode, and for the first time in over a week, I wasn't afraid. The next day I went back to collect Isla's things, on a schedule Carla had arranged with Marcus absent, which is how it's done, and I don't recommend it. Her crib, her books, her little chair. In the spare room closet, where Vivian kept boxes because her own apartment was small, there was a shoebox. I didn't have to open it. I opened it anyway. Divorce papers from 2002, Vivian's name beside a name I'd never heard spoken aloud. Underneath, a wedding photograph cut, not torn, not burned, cut with scissors in one careful straight line, the way you'd trim a hem. The man had been removed entirely, and what remained was a 40-year-old woman in a white dress laughing at something outside the frame. Her husband had left her in 2002 for someone he'd met at work, and she'd kept her own half of that photo for 22 years in a closet in her son's house. She never hated me for who I was. She'd made up her mind about women in general in 2002, and waited 22 years for one in a uniform to walk through her son's door and prove her right. That paternity report didn't convince Vivian of anything. It gave her permission. You can understand a person completely and still refuse to hand them your child. At 2 in the morning, back at the motel, I went to the testing company's website and found the box where you enter a kit identification number. It asked who I was in relation to the test, not whether I had any right to ask, because there is no chain of custody on consumer kits. Nobody verifies identity, which is the entire point of them, and it cuts both directions. I registered as a tested party, downloaded the PDF, and read it the way a logistics officer reads anything from the bottom up. Page 3, bottom, 8-point type. This test was performed without chain of custody. The identities of the tested parties were not independently verified. Results are for personal knowledge only and not admissible in a court of law. The report wasn't fraudulent. The lab hadn't erred. His own paperwork admitted in print that it could prove nothing about anyone, and he'd used it anyway because it was never meant for a judge. It was meant for a living room. Then page 2, the table of tested parties. Alleged father, sample collected March the 9th. Child, sample collected March the 9th. I sat up straight, because I could hear my husband's voice saying she's not mine in front of 28 relatives, and I knew precisely where my daughter had been that day. My leave ended a few days later, and I drove the 610 miles home with Isla asleep behind me. Back at Fort Rucker, I pulled records, the SIG. NIN log from the Child Development Center for the 9th. Weller, Isla, in at 7:10, out at 17:25, my initials beside her teacher's, because 2 adults sign a child in every day, a policy I'd rolled my eyes at for a year. The gate log at the main entrance, my plate scanned that morning. And I already knew where Marcus was on the 9th of March, because Marcus is always exactly where Marcus is at 6:30 in the morning. Carla's paralegal pulled it within a week. A point-of-sale receipt from the store, timestamp 6:41 a.m., 2 bags of feed and a box of fencing staples. So on his own report, the cheek swabbed on the 9th of March sat 610 miles from my daughter's cheek. The Army documents everything. It's the single most irritating trait of the institution, and it very likely saved my daughter's future, close enough that I've never made that joke again. He needed a cheek, and his own daughter's was 610 miles out of reach. So whose did he use? Here's what I did not do, and it's the backbone of everything after. I did not order another kit online. In early April, I drove to a collection site and booked a legal paternity test, a different process entirely, 6 times the cost. A technician I'd never met checked my license against my face, checked Isla's birth certificate, photographed us both, rolled our thumbprints. She swabbed my daughter's cheek herself. I wasn't permitted to touch it. She sealed the sample in front of me and signed a chain of custody form. $510. Then came the hard part, because this only works if the other party participates too. Carla sent a collection invitation to his attorney. He didn't show. She sent it again. He didn't show, so she took it to a judge. On a Tuesday in April, my husband sat in a strip mall collection office, pale as paper, and let a stranger check his ID and roll his thumbprint onto a card. He knew the answer before the swab touched his cheek. Everyone in that room did. Same technology, same swab, same science as the kit he'd thrown in my grandmother's recycling bin. One difference: somebody was watching. The email arrived a little after 4 in the morning, and I read it standing beside my car in a parking lot on post. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Marcus Colt is not excluded as the biological father of Isla Weller Colt. I got into the car and didn't start the engine. I read it maybe 6 times, then set the phone face down on my leg and did nothing at all. I mean that precisely. I didn't send it to Carla. I didn't send it to my mother. I didn't send it to Marcus or Vivian or a single person in Alder Creek or any human being on Earth. I sat alone in a parked car and was correct entirely by myself, which is a skill I've been very good at since I was about 19 years old. There was a knock on my window. First Sergeant Marguerite Boyd, 43 years old, who has never once in her life asked me how my weekend went, looked at my face through the glass for about 2 seconds and said the only line she gets in this entire story. "Ma'am, are you going to send that to somebody, or are you going to sit here and be right all by yourself?" I had won. I held it in writing, sealed in my own hand, and it fixed absolutely nothing. That was the moment I finally understood exactly what my husband had done to me. I called Carla that afternoon. She wasn't pleased. She went quiet, then said the thing I'd already worked out alone in that parking lot. He's going to withdraw before there's ever a hearing. His attorney reads that result and the petition evaporates within a week. No June court date, no judge, nobody in a robe ever says a word to anyone, because he never intended to reach a courtroom. He'd filed to make the story credible enough to tell out loud. The lab report was built for a living room. The affidavit was built for a rumor. He'd constructed exactly enough legal scaffolding to hold up a story and not an inch more, then aimed the whole thing at a town of under 2,000 people. If he quietly withdrew, that story would freeze forever in its most convenient shape. There was a test, and then they settled it privately. I would win and remain an unfaithful wife in that town's memory until I died, and my daughter would grow up in those same 30 square miles and hear it whispered by somebody's cousin at 15. He never built a legal case. He built a story. You cannot subpoena a story. Carla put it simply: I can get you a court order, I can't get you a town. I drove back up the following weekend and walked into the store at 7 in the morning, and Otto Vance was making coffee in the same pot he'd used since 1998. He's 51. He saw me and went completely still because he thought he already knew what was coming. I didn't accuse him of anything. I asked one question. Otto was 9 days accurate. He looked at me a long moment and said, "Yes, ma'am." That was all he intended to offer. He turned back toward the coffee pot. Then, with his back to me, in a voice I'd never once heard from him in over 20 years, he added one more line. "I know where every single item in this building is." Then he reached for the filters, and that was the end of it. He didn't want money. He'd never asked me for a cent in his life. He wanted to be seen, in the one building where he'd spent 26 years, by the one family whose name hung over the door. My grandmother had never fully seen him. Neither had I for 3 years from 610 miles away. He told the truth in that affidavit, every single word of it. That's the part I couldn't set down on the drive back. My husband needed a fabrication to come after me. Otto Vance only needed one fact. Carla filed our response the last week of April, attaching my family care plan, 20 pages naming exactly who takes my daughter if I deploy, complete with powers of attorney, medical releases, and my commander's signature. I didn't have that document because I'm clever. I had it because the Army requires it of every service member with a dependent. It happens to be one of the most thorough records of a mother's care that exists in ordinary life. His attorney read 20 pages of it and went quiet. Here's the arithmetic I worked out at my kitchen table with an actual calculator. Across 2 years, I'd been physically inside that store on 9 days. In those same 2 years, my daughter had slept under my roof 591 nights out of 602. Both numbers completely true. Otto had counted one of them. Nobody, including me, had counted the other until April. 6 weeks? That's how long it dragged, and 6 weeks doesn't sound like a siege until you've lived through one. Vivian at the diner on a Wednesday with the whole back section listening. In the middle of it, I drove up to sign paperwork and stopped for gas on Main. Vivian pulled up beside me and rolled her window down, 2 women fueling up at the pump behind us, and said the same 3 words she'd been saying since March. Leave right now. I said nothing again. 6 weeks, and I hadn't spoken one defensive sentence to a living soul. I sat at that pump and finally saw the habit for what it was. I'd been calling it discipline. It had quietly become something else, a reflex that kept my mouth shut while other people decided who my daughter's mother was. The flyer was taped in the window of the pharmacy, the diner, the bank, the post office. Bright yellow, Weller's Feed and Supply, 58 years. Saturday, the 10th of May, 10 to 2. Free hot dogs, door prizes, everyone welcome. I hadn't remembered the anniversary, I'd been busy. Marcus had remembered. Carla's paralegal found the invoice later, out of curiosity. He'd ordered those flyers back in January, 2 months before he filed a single paper. He'd been planning that Saturday since the dead of winter. And his attorney let one detail slip to Carla, the casual way lawyers do when they think a case is finished. At the anniversary event, my husband intended to announce publicly that he was taking over full day-to-day operation of the store. He didn't just want the building. He wanted the whole town on the sidewalk with a hot dog in hand, watching him receive it from a woman every one of them had been told was unfaithful. He'd booked the space, printed the flyers, invited the entire town. He'd done every part of that for me, and he had no idea. Between the results arriving and that Saturday, I had the truth in hand and didn't use it. People have called that grace. It wasn't grace, it was targeting. I considered releasing it and decided against it on purpose every time. I didn't call the paper, though I could have. I didn't post it anywhere. I didn't send that document to a single soul in the county, not Vivian, not Marcus, not my own cousin, nobody. I said nothing to my daughter, obviously, who was 14 months old and whose entire worldview revolved around bananas. That one was easy. 16 days I sat on it, because a true fact spoken in the wrong room is just another sheet of paper. I'd already watched a piece of paper get deployed expertly, in exactly the right room, and I'd taken notes. On the day before the anniversary, I printed 3 pages in the office of a motel off Route 35, 15 cents a sheet, and the clerk had to swap the paper tray because nobody had used that printer since maybe 2019. Page 1, the bottom of Marcus's own report, the disclaimer paragraph, circled in a pen I borrowed and gave back. Page 2, the sign-in sheet from the Child Development Center for the 9th of March. Page 3, the accredited lab result, seal, signature, thumbprint, reference number. I've spent more on a coffee I didn't finish. I want you to notice what I chose not to print, because it took me 2 full weeks to work that part out, and it may be the smartest decision I made in this entire story. I did not bring his report, not the whole document, not the front page with my daughter's name and the word excluded printed beside it. I only brought page 3, the fine print. I wasn't going to stand in a room and call my husband a liar out loud. I didn't need to say it. That's exactly what paper is for. I folded the 3 pages into my jacket pocket and sat on the edge of that motel bed one more time with the bathroom light on, my daughter breathing steadily in the next bed, and I thought about First Sergeant Boyd knocking on my window. The 10th of May was clear, about 60 degrees, which in central Ohio in May is a gift nobody quite trusts. By 11, close to 90 people filled the store and sidewalk. A grill going, somebody's uncle on the tongs, a cooler of lemonade. a banner zip-tied to the porch posts. Farmers I'd known my whole childhood, cleaned up for the occasion. 2 town council members, the pastor from 3rd Street. And above the door, exactly where my grandfather hung it in 1968, the bell. My mother met me at the door and lifted Isla off my hip like she'd been waiting 14 months to do it, because she had. Otto stood behind the counter in the same spot he'd held for 26 years. Vivian poured lemonade at a folding table like she owned the building, and something moved across her face when she saw me that I'd never seen there before. Near the back by the fencing supplies stood my husband's sister, Renee, 30, with her son Wyatt on her hip, 18 months old. I hadn't arranged that. She was there because the whole town had turned out. I want to be honest about the plan, too. 3 sheets of paper and 1 question. That was all of it. Around noon, Marcus tapped his wedding ring against the counter to quiet the room. I noticed that ring from 20 feet away, and I've never stopped noticing it since. 90 people went silent, and he began to talk, and he was genuinely good at it. He talked about my grandmother behind that counter at 84 with a pencil tucked behind her ear, about my grandfather and 1968 and a bell over a door. He mentioned it had been a hard year for the family, and let that sit as long as it needed to. Half the room studied their shoes, the other half studied me. Then he said it. Starting in June, I'll be taking over full day-to-day operation of this store. The room came apart in applause, the real kind. A man named Holloway, who'd farmed the ridge his whole life, shouted, "About time, Marcus." Vivian pressed a hand to her mouth by the lemonade table. Then my husband looked directly across 90 people at me, smiled warm as anything, and said, "And Dana came out today, too. We appreciate her making the trip." 90 people turned toward me with tremendous, misplaced sympathy. They felt sorry for him. That's precisely the current I was standing in. I handed my daughter back to my mother and walked to the counter. There's never been a microphone in that building. 90 people inside a hardware store isn't a stadium, it's a room, and a woman who briefs formations before sunrise can be heard in a room without raising her voice at all. I said his name. He turned around, still smiling, ready for whatever this was, because he'd been braced for me to make a scene since March and would have known exactly how to handle one. I asked him a single question. "On the 9th of March, whose cheek did you swab?" He said, "What?" I didn't repeat the question. This is the only part of that whole day that took any real nerve. I let the silence sit. I'd already waited 6 weeks. 4 more seconds cost me nothing. In those 4 seconds, 90 people watched a man fail to answer a question that only required a single name. That was the moment. Not the papers, though they came a beat later. The turning point was a man standing beneath a sign carrying his wife's family name, in front of every person he'd ever sold a bag of feed to, unable to say a name out loud. He tried. She hasn't been well," he started. I laid the pages down one at a time, face up, on wood my grandmother had stood behind for 40 years, and described each one the way you'd read off a supply manifest, flat, unhurried, boring. Boring was the whole strategy. "This is page 3 of your report," I said, sliding it across. The paragraph at the bottom. It says the test was performed without chain of custody, that nobody verified who was actually swabbed, that the results aren't admissible in any court. One beat. You read that in March. Then the second page. This is the sign-in log from the Child Development Center at Fort Rucker for the 9th of March. In at 7:10, my initials beside her teacher's. One beat. That's 610 miles from this counter. Then the last one. This one is mine. April, court-ordered collection. A woman neither of us had ever met checked both our photo IDs, took our thumbprints, sealed the sample in front of me. Accredited lab. Same swab, same science, same everything as yours. And then I allowed myself the on-lie sentence I'd saved across 6 weeks. That one has a chain of custody. I didn't read the number aloud. I didn't need to. It sat face up beneath the register, and Holloway, 60-some years old, hands like fence posts, who'd shouted about time only minutes earlier, leaned in and read it himself. Then he straightened up and looked at Marcus, and every single person in the store watched him do it. That's what I'd come for, not the paper. Holloway's expression changing. Near the lemonade table, Vivian set the pitcher down wrong and it tipped. My mother-in-law came apart in the middle of that store, 62 years old, at the 58th anniversary of a business her family had never held a single nail of, screaming that I was a liar, that I'd fabricated the whole thing, that she'd known exactly what kind of woman I was from the first dinner Marcus brought me to, and she'd said so to everyone. Then she repeated the same 3 words she'd used in March, and again through a car window in April. Leave right now. I didn't move a single foot. I answered at the exact volume I use before sunrise. Vivian, 1 beat. This is my building. There was nothing left for her to say to that. There is no answer to a plain fact. She was standing in the center of a building, carrying another woman's family name on the sign above the door, having just ordered that same woman to leave it. 90 people watched her understand that in the same second she did. She stopped talking entirely. Marcus never said another word, not that day, not for the rest of that month as far as I ever heard. Then from the back near the fencing, a paper cup hit the floor. Renee stood there with Wyatt on her hip, 18 months old in a little jacket, gnawing on his own fist, staring at the second page on that counter, the one dated the 9th of March. Nobody had to explain the arithmetic to her. She'd swabbed that child herself. 90 people turned toward her, and she said it, not really to me, not really to Marcus, not really to anyone at all. He told me it was just to settle something. Then she looked down at her son. Vivian sat down hard on Otto's stool. I didn't add anything else. There wasn't anything left to add. I left all 3 pages face up on that counter and didn't take a single one back because they were never for me. I walked around the end of the counter, lifted my daughter off my mother's hip, and walked out the front door, and my grandfather's bell rang exactly the way it has for 58 years. It doesn't know a thing about any of us. It just rings when somebody leaves. He withdrew the custody petition 8 days later. No hearing, no argument, no judge. The divorce was finalized that October, and he never pursued the store. His own attorney had known since March the LLC was airtight and had almost certainly said so and been ignored. Marcus left Alder Creek in August and works at a dealership in Indiana now. I hear he's good at it. I believe that because he genuinely was. I didn't sell the store. I did the one thing my grandmother never got around to. I made Otto Vance the store manager, $62,000 a year, 10% of profit, a 3-year contract. He read it twice with his glasses pushed down his nose, signed it, and said one thing. She'd have liked what he did with that website. Nobody in Alder Creek ever said a word to Vivian about it directly. That town does its quiet work in both directions. She stepped down from her committee that autumn. She's never apologized, and I stopped waiting for one a long time ago. Renee texted me a single line a few days after the anniversary. I answered her months later, and it was hard, and we still talk now. Wyatt and Isla see each other 3 or 4 times a year. Because neither of those babies did a thing to anyone, a part I'm still working through with myself. I'm still at Fort Rucker, still 610 miles. People want a dramatic scene for the part where I cut everyone off, and there isn't one. I updated my family care plan, Marcus's name removed, my mother listed as long-term caretaker, initialed by my commander on an ordinary Tuesday morning between 2 other appointments. That's the whole boundary. That's all it ever was. The 3 pages sit in a folder in a small safe in my quarters, and I haven't looked at them once since that Saturday, and I haven't told Isla any of it yet. There will be a day for that conversation. It isn't today. She's a toddler, and the only thing she needs to understand right now about who her family is who shows up when she cries. That question has never once been complicated. People ask if it felt satisfying. It did for about 4 days. It felt enormous. I won't perform a comm I didn't actually have. Then I discovered something nobody tells you going in. You don't get those 6 weeks back. Nobody refunds them. What I got instead was that I stopped needing a single person in that town to believe me. That turned out to be the only thing I ever actually needed. I didn't reclaim my name from Alder Creek. I just stopped lending it to them. He stood in a room full of his own family and said she isn't mine. And the one true part of that sentence is the part he never intended. She isn't anybody's. She's her own person. And the only people who get to stand close to her are the ones who show up when she cries. That's my story. 3 pages, 45 cents, and one question nobody could answer. If somebody ever hands you a document meant to end your life, read the last page first. The fine print at the bottom is where the truth has to live, because the law makes them put it somewhere. And if you know someone who needs to hear that today, send this to them. Thank you for watching. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.